Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining on the eve of a holiday weekend. Very grateful to you. I'm confident, though, it's going to be worth your while. I'm super excited about this. I usually am about most of our sessions, but especially excited about this. To have a brand new poll out of Pennsylvania that's got some interesting questions and results that we'll run through. You'll get the poll in my Substack and on Twitter after we finish this session, along with a video of the event. You can share the full poll with anyone you want, as long as you make sure to credit to Wick Insights and to Two-Way. And as always, you can share the video. Our four pollsters are four of the best pollsters in America. Super glad to have David Burrell of Wick Insights, who will go through the poll that he did in conjunction. There are polling partners with Two-Way. Celinda Lake, Democratic pollster, who's worked with the Democratic Party and presidential candidates, including the current one. And Seltzer, who I worked with when I was at Bloomberg, one of the best pollsters in America, nonpartisan pollster. And Patrick Ruffini, a Republican pollster, who's got a new piece out. And if you don't subscribe to his Substack, you should. So we're going to hear from all of them. As always on this platform, this is not about fighting. It's about learning, peace, love, and understanding. So they're going to have a very civil conversation. And as we bring you all in, if you want to be part of the conversation here on the Two-Way platform, raise your hand. When you come in, you'll be equally civil. And I hope that will extend on YouTube to the chat. I know it doesn't always, and that bothers some of you. I can't control the chat. But let's get started by bringing David Burrell in right away to the Pennsylvania poll, which looked at the presidential and some other questions of great interest. So David, come on in, and David's going to share his screen and then run through the deck. And it's going to start with the methodology of the poll, which is on the first slide. So David, go ahead and bring that in.
Great. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. All right, you seeing a slideshow, a deck?
Yes, sir. There it is. Cool. All right. So the first thing, David, I want you to talk about and address, and it's on the first page of the deck, which is how do you do your polling? Or live calls, internet, how do you do it?
Sure. Great. Yeah. So first off, thanks again for having me, Mark. Real excited to go through this. So from a methodology standpoint, taking a high level look at the poll. So as you can kind of see on the screen here, it's 1,600 completes, but the question is, how do we collect these completes, and what methods do we use? So we pull random samples of likely voters and new voters and all sorts of voter cell phone numbers. And we text links to a survey to those cell phones and invite them to take a survey, and that directs them to an online survey, which some of y'all probably received before. So it's a method of random sampling, probability sampling that we employ in order to hopefully get a good representative sample of voters. But we'll talk about that in a second. And then very similarly, we take a random samples of landlines, and we actually robo-poll those landlines, and 25% of the sample came from that type of recruitment.
Okay. So, and just to be clear, people see the date on this. This survey was done this week, so it's very current, but not done after the CNN interview. So to the extent you think the CNN interview had some dramatic impact in Pennsylvania, you'll have to be disappointed. But otherwise, this is as timely a set of data as you could get today anywhere on planet Earth. David.
Great. And yeah, so for this will be a short presentation because we got a lot of great pollsters. So I want y'all to get their insights. We want to answer questions, but we wanted to kind of go through 3 or 4 things. One is look at the race. What's the state of the race against from the presidential ballot in Pennsylvania? We want to look a little bit at the hypotheticals of what if Trump had chosen Haley, what if Shapiro was chosen for Harris's ticket, and see if that would have impacted the race as well. We're going to dive into the issues a bit. We're going to take a look at whether, try to tease out some insights on whether or not Kennedy's dropping out of the race and endorsing Trump and campaigning for him is going to have an impact, or, where voters are on that. And then the last thing is I'm going to talk briefly about a couple of challenges that are facing the polling industry right now. And so with that, I'll just get started. If that's good with you, Mark.
Yes, sir. Please do.
All right, wonderful. All right, so we start off just with the 5-way ballot test. Donald Trump was up in the 5-way ballot test by 0.9% actually, so 1% rounded. Not too much to go over here. This is, we're seeing Pennsylvania is close in a lot of different polls out there. And we'll talk a little bit more about what I think is driving this specific poll to look this way, kind of closer to the end, and when we get other pollsters coming in on the board. Second thing we wanted to look at is, hold on, getting my screen to go. we split off the sample to see what it looked like when you kind of changed the ballot up, when you didn't have any vice president names on the ballot, and it's just a head-to-head with Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Kamala Harris. And you can see that was tied very similarly to the five-way ballot test. When we looked at the hypothetical ballots, that's where you started to see a little bit more movement. And this is where we put the vice president's name in the question and in the answers. So they were selecting the presidential candidate with the vice president running mate. And, the only one real that really jumps off the page is, well, there wasn't a big move with putting Haley on it. And again, this is not, hypotheticals are very imperfect. So, you got to take this all with a grain of salt, but there is insight here. Or there would have been an insight if Trump was performing 5 points better with Haley, of course. But of course, as you're kind of seeing here, you have a very popular governor in Shapiro. I think a lot of Pennsylvanians are very disappointed that he was not picked. And you're seeing that he actually was outperforming, significantly, at least statistically significant for this poll, at or outside the margin of error. When we paired his name with with Harris, in the head-to-head against Trump and Vance. Moving on from this, of course, we can always come back later. I just want to get all the brains together as quickly as possible. We looked at some issues. Oh, sorry, my apologies. The next slide is actually the Senate race. My apologies. And as you can see that in this situation, Harris is underperforming Casey by about 3 points here. He's got a 2-point lead. So in this poll, right, I know it's closer to 4 or 5 in some others, but that's just where this one shook out. And it's a very, like Mark said, a very fresh poll. So let's talk about some issues, because I do think that there's some key things that are interesting here. One of them is obviously you're going to see stopping inflation as the number one issue for people, legal immigration, but preserving the integrity of the American democratic process is also really high up there. And that was also high up in 2022. It really dipped down after that. Saving democracy and threats to democracy, as I think how we were all asking it back in 2022. But it went down and it's now creeping back up. And what you're going to see in a couple of different slides is it's actually creeping up, not because of the left or the Democrats starting to index it higher than they were before. It's more because the Republicans are and the independents are. So you're kind of getting a combination of that. Doesn't just mean Jan 6 to people like it kind of did 2 years ago. Taking a look at which, so we list a number of desirable outcomes that I think most people believe is desirable outcomes, and we ask which candidate, Trump or Harris, would be more effective. They think would be more effective in achieving those outcomes. And as Mark said last night, I'm sure a couple of these are making Trump's team pull his hair out because I do think that it's real that Kamala on some of the issues has been able to close the gap. And I think that matters. And the question is, will it sustain? As Mark was saying yesterday, that Trump's team thinks they can, through advertising and just more exposure, they can fix this. But it's a real shift. So, and again, to highlight what I was saying before, preserving the integrity of the America's democratic process is right here, and it's a concern for both. I mean, you can kind of see both sides are concerned about this. Okay, view alignment. So this is kind of standard. Which one's views on the issues do you think aligns most with yours? And you're kind of seeing where that landed. Not too many surprises here. Again, we can come back to any of these anytime. So what about RFK? I think that I have a lot of thoughts about the polling surrounding RFK, dating back to his high points and his low points and what was real and what was not real. But what you're seeing here is, from the visualization from the crosstabs where we say, if you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of if you have a favorable opinion of RFK, what you're seeing here is you are supporting Donald Trump. If you have an unfavorable opinion of RFK, you're supporting Kamala Harris. So I don't know how this is ultimately going to impact the ballots, right? But this is a pretty good slide to show if you had a favorable opinion of RFK, who his people are going over to Trump's side more than they are to Harris's side. And I'm not saying, this isn't saying if you were going to vote for him before he dropped out. It's just saying if you had a favorable opinion of him. So moving on to one of my fun slides is, so this is a bit about methodology. So Mark may want to talk about this a little bit more, but y'all, I'm sure we've all grown to how inaccurate polling can be sometimes and how it changes all over the place. And on this slide that we're recognizing, have been really recognizing the past few years, when I was talking to you about the methodology, we were talking about using, probability sampling. A lot of the polls you see out there now, not going to say any names, it's not a bad thing, but they're using panels, which is people who are opted in and paid to take surveys. So it's a different type of, it's certainly a very different type of sampling technique that has challenges because it's not random sampling, right? And and there's ways to improve it. It's great for ad testing, but there are issues with it. So our methods are supposed to be random samples. And what you're seeing here, which was not the case years ago, and also I think that these numbers would have changed 4 months ago, which we'll talk about in a minute, is when we're naturally doing these random sampling, the Democratic, Republican, Independent party identification, right? This is party ID, not necessarily registration, came in kind of how we think it should have. If you go look at a number of the polls out there right now, this is about where they're having their party as well. But at the same time, so that's coming in looking good. Education is coming in terrible, just naturally. So this is halfway through the poll when we start looking and saying, hey, where do we need to start adjusting our sampling techniques to hit our quotas? And we say, oh, wow, we have way too many postgrads and a few too many four-year degrees coming into the survey. So why this matters is there's issues with random sampling that did not exist, in my opinion, years ago. And I have my thoughts about why that is, and we may get to that later. And it's driving some issues with the polling. And an example of that would be that, and look, two of the three polls I looked at in Pennsylvania prior to running this one didn't even add post-grad degree. They had 4 years or more. So you might not even be able to catch that. So even though you've asked education, you actually have way too many post-grad degrees in your survey. And, if we allow this to continue to happen, just to let you know, the impact of it is the independents would have been breaking more towards Kamala, and she would have been winning in this poll. So it does make a difference. And this is just one example of issues that I'm seeing across the board and survey sampling that are driving big changes in polls. And I think that naturally, if you had gone right after the Biden debate, I don't think the postgrads would be this high. I think because they're much more likely to be liberal, and they're dejected and not taking surveys. So there's some new techniques we're having to address or utilize in order to try to get representative sampling and address some of the issues with the polling going all over the place, as it has been over the last few years, really, probably since 2016, maybe even before that. So that's it for the presentation. Hope it was education.
David, thank you. That's great. David, thank you. Unshare your screen. We only have Celinda for about 15 more minutes. Celinda, so grateful to you because we all know how busy all of you are. But love to get your reaction to what David just presented, and including, if you would, weighing in on this question of how a pollster keeps from oversampling and looking for likely voters, folks who with post advanced degrees, and what that means.
So, David, really interesting poll, and great to be seeing you. It is a little bit more conservative than most of the polls that we're seeing, but I think, Pennsylvania is really tight. And as other battleground states have been moving in Harris's direction, this has been one that is a little more resistance, in part because people don't realize, but you would, that Pennsylvania is the oldest of the battleground states. People think it's Arizona or something, but it's not. It's Pennsylvania. So that obviously that age distribution works against Harris because she has such a dramatic age relationship, and you saw that somewhat in your polls. There's also a big gender gap in Pennsylvania, and your data shows that as well. And I think this is emblematic of all of the close states. We've got to win women by more than we lose men. That's really the formula for success. And there are two parts to that. And Anne is an expert on this, but it's real whack-a-mole. You got to keep men sullen but not mutinous, and you got to win women enthusiastically. And then the turnout of African-American votes is always up for grabs in Pennsylvania. So that's all of issue. This education piece is a very big deal, and education is a stronger predictor right now than a lot of other variables that we're used to
Mhm.
looking at. And the education gap is bigger than some of the other gaps we're used to looking at, like the gender gap, the marriage gap, the age gaps. So this education piece is very big. Most of the private pollsters have some way of dealing with this.
Right.
People have become aware of it. And I would say all the private polls are either setting quotas, stratifying their sample, although the census information on education is not very good. And I'd be really interested to know what methodology you're using. But one way or the other, and most of the private polls have post grad for exactly the reason you're
Right.
suggesting, because you really get a bounce with the post grads. So that I think the private pollsters are quite aware of it. And we are constantly critiquing a lot of the public polls and saying it's too educated, it's too educated, it's too educated. That's why we're looking better. So that is a very good thing for you to lift up. And I think it's a very good criteria. And people have no idea how non-college educated America is. I mean, 2/3 of young people are not going to have 4-year degrees. And people think every young person is on a college campus. Not really. And in fact, if you look at the white male new young people, Trump is winning them. And RFK probably helped him with that particular audience. So it hurt him with a lot of other audiences. But so I think the college thing that you're lifting up may be the most important thing for people on this Zoom to remember and to take away. And it's really
Yeah.
good that you lifted it up.
And I want to add one thing and get y'all's feedback on it ultimately as well as, and we're trying to, you know, as y'all know in the space, it's rapid fire when you have clients paying for polls, and those are sometimes the best polls, right? Because you got it's not just the public ones we put out there, right? We're also seeing issues because it illustrates the point that, you know, that, and if you had true like random probability sampling, like that would not happen. Like there's something driving it. And we're also seeing, I don't think it's the only thing. I think it's the one we've kind of learned from 16 and 20, and we're catching at least privately, but we're seeing stuff if we could spend more time on it, also on geography. You know, saying you got the right mix of urban, suburban, rural, small towns. Well, where are they? And we're seeing it's like it's not distributed right. And these areas are very different. So we're looking at ways to bring more data in to say, how can we like create better, you know, non-standard urbanist geographic segments to look at things at and say, what, yeah, we have the right people in urban areas, but they're all in this type of urban area or something like that. So we're seeing that too. But it's a sampling problem. And that's what the key takeaway I want people to understand, like you said, is there's issues.
Thank you.
I think
Yeah,
most
go
of the
ahead.
private pollsters stratify by geography. We certainly do, and so that protects a little bit. We don't get all of our urban sample in city center or in suburban. We stratify pretty aggressively. The other thing that we do is and this is something that caught a lot of pollsters, not Ann and us actually, but a lot of the other pollsters in 2016 was that we had different response rates. And we at the time were replacing not Trump. A lot of people were just replacing someone that they couldn't get with someone else. And that meant they often were retracing a Trump voter with a Biden voter. We even in 2016 were modeling what kind of voter we thought you would be. And we replaced a Trump voter with a model Trump voter. And now that's pretty common practice. And there may be other techniques that people are using too. So response rate matters a lot as well.
Yeah. Patrick, I'd love for you to talk about Pennsylvania, about David's poll, and about methodology in whatever order or ratio you'd like.
Sure. Well, I agree with the assessment that this is the one. This is the state. It is both the most important state in this election, and the one that you know, I think it is ultimately going to prove the hardest of the Rust Belt states for Harris to crack. And that's for a few reasons. One of which Celinda mentioned, which is the age factor. I think to some extent Joe Biden did have a little bit of a hometown effect in Pennsylvania, where you actually split the state down the middle in half in the eastern part of the state, close to where he grew up, sort of influenced by the Philly media market. He did 3 or 4 points better relative to 2016 than in the western part of the state, where Democrats have been bleeding support for election cycle after election cycle. You know, I think the fact that Joe Biden is a Northeastern Catholic, probably helped him, right? That was probably a factor that helped him. Not something that's discussed and not something that really Harris can replicate. So I think losing this matters, that those kinds of factors obviously matter less and less, but they still matter in a very, very, very tight election. And so I want to also point to the issues we've been discussing. There's a post this week by Mark Harris, Republican strategist in Pennsylvania, that talks about this exact same issue that he is seeing in his polls of the state, where what you're seeing is a distinct drop-off, not of white working class voters generally, but rural white working class voters. So even when you do all the stratification by education, when you do the quota, by party, either by party ID, education, geography, what have you, if you're not taking into account the interaction of geography and demography, right? What's gonna end up happening is those rural white working class voters who are probably, 3-1 Trump at this point, are going to get replaced in the survey by maybe a white working class voter in Northeast Philly. That's for Trump, but not quite. 75-25 is more like a 60-40 voter. And as a result, you might get results like the New York Times poll, which New York Times poll, I think they are an excellent poll. However, in the last survey they had of Pennsylvania, it showed Trump ahead among white non-college voters by, I think it was 10 or 15 points, which just doesn't really wash but all polls are going to have those, and I don't think we should be crosstab diving or picking apart polls too much, because all polls are going to have some disparity like that. But just to highlight, in both 2016 and 2020, the polling error was far worse in these Rust Belt states than it was in the Sun Belt states. It was far worse in a state. I mean, it was the worst. It was pretty bad in Pennsylvania. The worst offender both years was Wisconsin. And that's because, and I think, you look at where the Trump vote is in these states, and it happens to be a very rural vote, and in many cases, a vote that does not look like a traditional Republican voter. In many cases, these are registered Democrats and still registered Democrats in the file. And you've seen Republicans make pretty strong registration gains in Pennsylvania because as you have these older rural Democrats coming off the file or switching parties, but if you have the right, let's say, party registration mix in your poll, you're going to probably get, it's going to be a more Democratic sample because you're going to get partisan Democrats and partisan Republicans when you have a pretty significant slice of that electorate that is not a very partisan Democrat, that just hasn't updated their voter registration yet.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Anne is going to share her screen and run through some thoughts she has. And then I'm going to ask you a couple questions that I'm interested in, and then we're going to open it up to everybody else. So Anne, go ahead and share and take it away.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for sending the data for me to do a little bit of a dive. As a pollster, and I'm sure that the other three would agree, we like to look at a lot of numbers all in one piece of paper to see if we can spot trends and the dynamics internally to the poll. So, David, I very much appreciate your polling here, and I thought some things dropped off the page a little bit. So you tested a number of horse races, and that's what I have across the top here. The overall numbers, as you showed, was a 1-point race for Trump. When it was 5-way in just a head-to-head, it was a tie. When they mentioned the current vice presidential candidate, it gave Harris a 1-point edge. If they swapped out Haley on the Republican side, that went even a little more strongly for Harris. That's a point, it's about the same. But Shapiro is the game changer in a poll in Pennsylvania. So here are the overall numbers. Like Celinda, I'm interested in the gender gap because I think the difference between what women win with, how Democrats win with women and how Republicans win with men is very telling about the whole size of the race. So among men, you see consistently that Trump has the advantage, and sometimes it's as high as 14 points. When they mentioned Haley, it drops down to just 5 points. McCormick in the Senate race is looking to win handily, but you see this big number swap to Harris leading if Josh Shapiro were her running mate. So a complete swap from where the overall numbers are with men to a switch to the other side. With women, as Celinda said, you have to win more women than you lose men if you're a Democrat, and you don't really see that happening. It's pretty consistently Harris all the way across. The biggest number is in the two-way race, Casey winning by about the same margin with women. And then I'm always interested in who might be swing voters. So I pulled out the people who self-identify as moderates, and the margins are huge. Harris wins by 33 points in the five-way, and as much as 43 points if it were Shapiro there, but they're pretty consistently very high numbers. So I don't know the role that moderates are going to play in this. They're 32% of this sample. So it's not a small slice of the electorate here, but that's a big number. You don't see the same thing by pulling out people who identify neither as Republican nor as Democrat, but as independents. And that's a smaller slice of the sample, but you see it's red. So meaning the advantage goes to Trump across all of these races. It's a tie. If they mention the current vice president name, I'm not sure what that signifies, but it is a 9-point advantage to Harris in the hypothetical where Governor Shapiro is her candidate. Again, it goes back to red in the Senate race, so that independents look to be more on the Republican tilt, moderates, and I'd be curious, David, if you have some thoughts about this, as they are exceptionally strong on the Democratic side.
Well, yes, and my first thought is I hope we didn't code moderates wrong on that on the crosstabs when we brought the data in last night. So no, that's surprising to me. And again, I do know that if we again did not control for certain things such as education, if that changes, like you said, it is such a strong predictor right now. If a more post-grad group turns out to vote, then those independents start to flip over to Harris pretty quickly, just because there's such a strong correlation between an independent's education level and who they're going to vote for in this election. But no, I'm surprised to see this, and I'm going to have my team. I'm texting them now to check and make sure that we had that. Unless y'all have seen this something that high in the other polls, I'm wondering if something was wrong with the crosstab. To be honest, on the moderates.
Okay, let's wait and see if you get a real-time response. And if you could unshare, I want to ask one question. I'm going to not ask both my questions, but before we lose Linda, I want to ask about reproductive rights. And go ahead and put up the tweet that I did. And this is something you've seen Donald Trump in the last week, yesterday on 2 issues, previously on Truth Social, saying he'd be so wonderful for women and reproductive freedom. He clearly is feeling the pressure of this issue and the potential it has to cost him the race. Not overstating the case. So go ahead and put up that tweet if you would. And Celinda, I just want your reaction to this issue, which is when you see it, you'll see a number of Republicans have won quite handily in races in important states who were pro-life, staunchly pro-life. Doug Ducey in Arizona, Brian Kemp in Georgia, Glenn Youngkin, DeSantis. These people are more pro-life than Donald Trump, and yet they've been able to win in competitive states, particularly the 2 that are battlegrounds here. So, Celinda, I'd love, before we lose you, to just comment on that question of why is this seemingly more of a threat to Donald Trump than it was for Brian Kemp in Georgia, than it was for Governor Ducey in Arizona, and on others besides the 4 listed here. Hold on, got on you. Go ahead.
Thank you. One of the things, David, to reassure you, there are a lot of moderate Dems in PA. And okay. So maybe your crosstab's wrong. I actually think your crosstab is probably right.
Okay, good.
And
I didn't look at that when I shot it out to y'all.
In the Scranton-Lehigh area.
Okay, good.
So first of all, I would say some of those Republicans were not thought to be anti-choice, just like Donald Trump was not thought to be anti-choice in 2016. I mean, we tested over and over again, and people said, like, we said, I was moderating groups in Michigan, he's going to defund Planned Parenthood. And people laughed at me and said, he's probably paid for 3 abortions at Planned Parenthood. Don't be ridiculous. So I think there is a post-Dobbs world and a pre-Dobbs world. But people we polled against Youngkin on abortion, and people did not believe he was anti-choice, or that he would act on it. And, you know, he ran a very good 2-tiered campaign where he was right-winger by night and moderate by day. And that 2-tiered, he got away with it. It really worked. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is people don't want the states to act on this. They want a national action, one way or the other. I mean, the pro-choice voters want national guarantee. By 2-1, voters want national or state action. The pro-choice voters want national guarantee. The pro-life voters want national ban. So the presidential, and after the Supreme Court decision, the presidential position is a lot more relevant. People think, oh, well, I don't think my governor is going to particularly focus on this. I don't think my governor is going to act on this. For example, with Kemp, people think, I don't think Kemp's really focused on the abortion issue one way or the other. He's not moving on it. So I think that is part of the reason. And then a much more aggressive campaign has been run against Trump on the abortion issue. And it's been a 2-year campaign. And it really moved members. It moved from 35% to 76% who thought he would sign a ban. And that's when he must have seen the same numbers, because he came out and said, I won't sign a ban, and had Vance say, I won't sign a ban. So he's trying to have it both ways. And they have been trying very, very hard to right-size themselves, because he thinks his party went too far. And, you know, like on the IVF issue, the dirty little secret is IVF is very expensive. 46% of the people who have IVF treatments are Republicans, because Democrats can't afford IVF. Democrats often have insurance that doesn't cover IVF. So this, I think Trump knows his peers. He knows that the party has gone too far, and he wants desperately to get this issue. He wants desperately to have it both ways. And he wants this issue to be less of a focus. And those Haley numbers make sense to me, because they're pro-choice Republican, college-educated, independent, moderate women. Of the Haley vote, those are the people that have gone to Harris. So I'm not surprised when you put Haley up. It's like, yeah, I'm going with both my girls.
Yeah. So Linda, before you go, if you need to go, you'll just tell me. If Trump continues these gambits, free IVF, saying he's not going to vote for the Florida bill, ballot measure, even though they kind of pulled it back, saying on Truth Social he'll be great for reproductive rights. How would you rate the chances of success that he can take the edge off this issue and not be seen as anti-women and anti-abortion?
I'd be really interested in Anne's opinion too. I think it's tough, because we still got the Supreme Court. I mean, the law is the law. And unless he's going to reinstate a national guarantee for abortion. And one of the things that was great about him saying, I'm going to leave it up to the states, the day after that, Arizona made their decision, and they didn't send it back to 1960, they sent it back to 1864. So proving some states are batshit crazy. And that 2/3 of the vote that doesn't want to leave it up to the states doesn't want to leave it up to the states, and are impacted by people moving. Like the Illinois voters, very impacted by Missouri women. They've set up whole clinics along the border. So I think voters, no matter what he's doing, voters think it's your Supreme Court. One of the other things that I think is more salient, Democrats never voted and independents never voted the Supreme Court. The right voted the Supreme Court. Not true anymore after Dobbs. And one of the things when you say to people, you have to tell them how many judges there are, because they don't know how many judges are on the Supreme Court. But when you tell people that Donald Trump could appoint 3 justices of the 9, and that could take him to a 7-2 margin, people are like, whoa, that will not be a good idea. And so I think that Supreme Court narrative can help reinforce the abortion narrative.
Linda, thank you. If you do need to go, we're grateful to you for joining. Okay, so thank you for joining. I appreciate it. Patrick, and then Ann, and then David, brief comments, if you would, on the abortion issue, and then we're going to open it up to the group. But Patrick, what do you think of Trump's chances of diminishing the impact of this one issue, which he's obviously quite concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would. I think both candidates are really trying to whitewash in some degree, like the vulnerabilities that they have on the issue. Starting with, obviously Harris moving pretty strongly in the direction. I mean, changing many of her positions, but particularly embracing going much further than Biden did in her rhetoric on illegal immigration and border security. And really running an ad out of the Bill Clinton 1996 playbook, talking about how she was a border state prosecutor. Notice they don't mention California. I think likewise, Trump is trying to do the same thing on the abortion issue, right? In many ways, returning to I think that 2016 view of him, right, where he was not, he had to placate the religious right with, the idea that I'm going to nominate Supreme Court justices off this list provided to me by the Federalist Society because I don't really care very much about the issue. The issues that I care about are trade and immigration, and I'm just going to outsource this whole piece of it. So he does that, and it comes back to bite him, right? I mean, it comes back to say, and it comes back to, a political situation that he doesn't want, and he never wanted, but it was never, his priority as president to really kind of steer court appointments, right, in a way that other presidents would. And so, to some degree, he's returning to, I think, his initial political instincts from New York when he was vocally pro-choice. And, I don't know what his actual position and how his actual position has changed over time. But I do think he has a nose for where voters in the center of the electorate are on this.
Yeah. And love for your brief comments on abortion, and then I want to go to the community questions.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that in 2015, 2016, Donald Trump made his bed with the evangelicals, and that is the cornerstone of his support. And if you think that there aren't more Trump voters to be recruited out there because of how polarized things are, you have to worry about that evangelical rock, trickling away, because they were very much in it for the abortion question. They were, from focus groups I did around the state, they're all about saving babies. And if that's not the worry anymore, and they listen to what Trump is saying this time, they go, I don't know why I'm voting at all.
Right.
I think that's more of the danger than that they will switch parties.
Got it. Thank you. All right, Ash.
You can go. Back to debate.
Yeah, David, go ahead.
So I think the debate's going to matter. And I think one thing it does is probably limits one of Trump's, gives him an easy answer and something that people probably don't know. I mean, not everyone's following what he's saying about this issue right now. And so I think, one of his liabilities and one of his vulnerabilities in the debate is going to probably help him he's got answers that people are going to be surprised about and want to hear. I mean, like Celinda said, went from whatever 30 something to 70 something that percent said he would do a national ban. And so, but I don't know if he'll win people back with just advertising, but that might be kind of a help for him, I think.
Yeah. Okay, great. Ash, come on in. If you want to get a question, and please raise your hand. Got as many as you can in the remaining time. Ash, tell folks who don't know where you are, who you're supporting, and any question you want, polling methodology, specific public data, whatever you'd like.
Yeah, so Pittsburgh suburbs on the Harris side of the fence. Love the experts. I'll say a quick few comments and go back on mute so my kids don't ruin the chat here. But just a few things. In a margin of error race, I look at a few things. So enthusiasm, head-to-head favorability gap, and then what's happening on the voter registration, right? So I look at some of the latest Gallup numbers. Harris is up to 78%, I think, in enthusiasm from Democrats to 62% for Trump. Big. So just for the group, like that number is the highest since Obama 08.
Yeah.
So
Ash,
massive
I'm
numbers.
Ash, I'm just going to ask a question because I do want to get folks in. So if you've got a question,
no problem. Sorry. My question was, what do you guys make of all the voter registration information that came out today that showed young Black women up 175% increase, Black women up almost 100%? What do you guys make of those numbers that came out comparing this months ago? Thanks.
Ash, where was that data?
That was it was on CBS News today. It's from Target
Okay.
Smart. It's just using
Okay.
voter registration data.
Okay. Patrick, do you know about that?
Yeah, no, I've seen that. I've seen that. I've also seen really just consistently throughout the year, Republicans have actually increased, especially like in a state like Pennsylvania, but have increased their share of voter registration in across states. Part of this is, again, it's not necessarily it's a trailing indicator. It's not, it's a change in attitude. So all year, and really leading up to this, Republicans have been, I think, doing a little bit better on the voter registration front. But that's the caveat, the asterisk on that is that's when Biden was in the race. And you had a demoralized Democratic base as long as Joe Biden was in the race. And so I think there's probably a fair amount of pent up energy on the Democratic side in the last few weeks in a state like Georgia in particular. You've had probably Democrats playing some catch up. Now, an interesting thing in a state like Georgia, we don't know if they're Democrats or Republicans, right? When they register in a lot of states, we don't know if they're Democrats or Republicans. In Pennsylvania, we do, but in Georgia, we don't until they pick a primary, until they vote in a primary, we don't know. But looking at specifically these specific demographics where Biden was really lagging behind, but Harris has been able to make up some ground. Now, that said, I think like, I think in the polling we've done and the polling we've released, we're seeing Democratic enthusiasm spike, but it's spiking to the level that Trump enthusiasm has been all year. So it's not that there's necessarily one side has the advantage. Both sides are very energized, and I think that's going to mean higher turnout, by at least 10 million votes compared to when Biden was in the race.
And getting to 2020 levels, or not necessarily?
I think that maybe we will get close to 2020 levels in absolute numbers. Obviously, population growth since 2020. I don't know that we'll get to 2020, but we'll see.
Okay, Ann or David, do you want to weigh in on that?
I'm going to go look up the CBS News report.
Okay, keep
Thanks
looking.
for the tip.
All right,
Yeah,
Stephen.
Go ahead.
David, go ahead.
No,
Go
I
ahead,
didn't have
David.
much to add in addition to what Patrick said.
Okay, Stephen, come on in. Tell folks who don't know where you are, who you're supporting, and your question about polling.
I'm in San Francisco Bay Area county, and I'm voting for Trump. And my question is really, I'm a numbers guy, so when I see, typically that single women tend to gravitate toward Democrats, and then if you look at who's going to school more and more, wouldn't that just normally, if more women are going to school, wouldn't that just pump the education numbers higher Democrat? And I mean, so does it mean the same thing as it used to mean? Because you've got people that are going to like general studies, they're getting degrees in things that maybe don't require a degree, they don't know what they want, and they're still being bartenders. But now they would used to be non-educated, now they're going to be registered as educated. It's the same. That demographic is changing.
I'll just chime in here, Stephen, that the and I don't have it in current data, but not only do single women trend toward Democrats, so do single men. So there's as much of a marriage gap, whether you're married or not, is a predictor, pretty good predictor of which way you're going to vote.
David?
No, I agree. I think that, if you ask me right now, if you take a look at a lot of different voting groups, and will Trump do better or worse than he did in 2020 compared to 2020 this year, I'd say single women, especially, probably almost in all age brackets, I think he'll probably do a little worse on. Whereas married women, I don't think he'll do worse on. I think he'll do about what he did, which wasn't good. But I will say that the single men, as was just mentioned, are left-leaning as well, especially the younger ones, but they're trending back to the direction of Trump compared to the 2020 numbers, at least in our research.
Okay, Stephen, thank you for the question. Appreciate it. Michelle, tell people who don't know where you're from, who you're supporting, and your polling question.
Yeah, I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm voting for Harris. I never vote for Trump. I was just wondering if there's a crosstab about educated, not school educated, but high information voters versus low information voters. and what that tells you.
You mean specifically in David's poll or just in general?
Well, since we're mostly talking about David's poll, yes.
Yeah.
No, we did not ask a question that would give us an indication of, how closely they're following the race. And that self-reported data is not always that reliable as well. But it definitely can give you insights. But we didn't have one on this one. I'd be curious if Ann or Patrick has anything to add on that they've seen in other polls. It's not something I think it's an interesting question. It's not something that we've been tracking too much because it's kind of hard to measure.
Ann and Patrick, is that something you'd aspire to know? And if so, is there a way to get at it that's not self-reported that would be meaningful and cost effective?
I would say no, there's not a way to get that other than what's self-reported. This election cycle is so different in so many things that are breaking major news stories. It's almost hard to ignore what's going on with the campaign because of such startling news development. So my guess would be there are fewer who know next to nothing, and we've seen that as a decent slice of the electorate in past cycles. I think that's going to be smaller this time around.
Patrick?
I don't really have anything to add. I think that everything I've seen, it's fairly even, but the challenge with polling is what we really, really do want to know about those people who aren't paying very close attention to the election, because even if, they're evenly split, right, that's where the undecided vote is going to be. People who are paying close attention generally know where they stand politically. And so I'm really interested in that other half of the equation.
Yeah. All right, Michelle, thank you. Come back regularly. Enjoy having everyone, particularly those of you who live in the states that are picking our president. Jason, come on in. Tell folks who don't know where you're from, who you're supporting, and ask your polling question.
I am from the San Francisco Bay Area in the city and county of San Francisco itself. I had been supporting the couch when it was Trump v. Biden, and now I'm loosely in the Kamala Harris camp. My question is in terms of polling motivation to work, or rather to vote. It seems like this is definitely going to be a turnout election rather than a convincing election. And so for me, I'm maybe a little bit less concerned about the inches in the middle of the candidates and where the independents are going to fall, and maybe more, what amount of excitement there is to vote for Trump, to vote for Kamala Harris, to vote at all. And so how do you actually, discern someone's likelihood to vote, given that everyone wants to think, oh, of course I'm going to go and vote and I'm engaged and I'll get out there, when in reality we know that, that's simply not the case.
Yeah. Jason, let me just say from my point of view, I'm not as expert as others. I think every election is a base election and a persuasion election. I think it's a mistake to ever say this election is just one or the other, particularly if it's close, it's going to be both. We talked a little bit about likely voters. And Patrick, David, Ann, I'd love for you guys to say, when people look at polls, and as we increasingly move away from registered to likely, how do you know if a poll has got a good screen? Does it matter that much?
It's very difficult to even find a definition of what the pollster has decided is going to count as a likely voter. We have a very simplistic approach, and if you look at it on paper, you would say this can't possibly work. But we have a single question that asks people, how likely are you to vote? Will you definitely vote, probably vote, might or might not vote, or probably not vote? So to the extent that it has worked very well, the beauty is that there's a positive social answer in probably voting, which is a step off of definitely. And we don't take you if you say probably. We only take the definites. Now, is it true that there are some people who tell us they will definitely vote, don't? That's true. Are there some people who say they will probably vote, who do vote? That's true. So far, and all we can tell is how accurate the polls have been, it works out in terms of the cross-pollination there.
Can I add maybe a third category? Because I think there's going to be record amounts of early voting. So is there like another category you would add of have already voted?
Yes, they're just now starting to allow people to apply for an absentee ballot. Absentee voting, depending on what state you're in, is going to happen in October. Maybe some states late September. Once that is started in a state where we're polling, we say, or have you already voted? That's the best kind of likely voter you've got, because their vote's already in the camp.
All right. Thank you, Jason. Appreciate it. Come back often. I'm glad you're off the couch. Appreciate it. All right. Unmuting. Mandarava. Have I pronounced that correctly? Or close to it?
Yes.
Yes. All right. Tell everybody where you are, who you're supporting, and your polling question, please.
Okay, I'm in Los Angeles. And what were the other questions you wanted me to answer?
Who you're supporting?
Trump.
Trump. Okay. And what's on your mind about polling?
Okay. Are there, and please answer honestly, not that you would do otherwise. Oh crap. Embarrassing. Oh God. Okay. Are there pollsters with bias that are intentionally putting out inaccurate information?
Yeah. You guys get that question all the time too, as do I. So who wants to have at it? There's lots of suspicion on the left and the right. If there's a poll that they don't like, that the poll was done crookedly in order to influence the outcome. In your experience, guys, does that happen?
Well, I think one thing I know happens is when internally you get a good poll, whether you're trying to make it good or not, as the pollster of the campaign, it gets put out there, right? So the bad polls don't get put out there. So and so we when we're doing internal polling, and sometimes that's what you're seeing. They'll do press releases on it and so forth. It's
David, I want to interrupt you, right? There's pollsters who are legit who just have a bad poll, because even if you're doing a perfect methodology, 1 in 20 or so polls are bad. But are there people whose polls get covered in the news who are malicious actors who cook the books? Does that exist in your experience or not? Because people on the left and the right both believe that it does. You don't need to name names, but does that exist? Do you ever see polls covered in the news, either on the left or the right, or in the regular media, and you say, I know for a fact that that person is not legit?
So I would suspect that maybe, I don't know anyone who does that. I can't, I mean, obviously this is the world Patrick and Anna, we work in. I can't say, yeah, this is the person who always does that. So I can't say that I know anyone who does, but it would not surprise me if there are, some groups out there that are doing it.
The thing I'll chime in with is that for me, I'm unaligned by party and I don't work for candidates and all of that, but I say to my clients of all ilk, the best news a poll is ever going to give you is the truth. Because if you don't know what's the most accurate read of the electorate, how is it that you're going to respond? So I don't know that they're doing a service to their candidate or to their supporters to think that the race is better than it is. And vice versa. I don't think it does a service.
I'm not going to name names, but I can tell you that there are some of the most famous pollsters in America. Some of the most famous. I'm not saying you three or anybody like you, but people who a lot of people on here have heard of. I've been told throughout my career, that person, talking about more than one person, that person doesn't do real polls. That person does polls for their clients to make their clients feel good or bad, depending on how they want their clients to feel, or that person puts up public polls to influence it. So I've been told that about very prominent pollsters. I don't know that it's true, but I certainly know that some political professionals make that accusation against famous pollsters.
Of course it's true. Of course.
Of course it's true. All right, you say. Patrick, you're totally silent. Do you want to say anything about this? Or
well, no, I mean, it's much the same as David. I mean, look, do I know for a fact that there's anybody who is doing anything such as, I mean, just say like either making up data or saying they're conducting a poll when they don't. I think that is unlikely. With that said, there was a pretty big controversy, right, in 2022 when you had certain averages, certain polling averages that only admitted certain pollsters, and many of those pollsters, were putting out data saying there's going to be a massive red wave, and then it turns out that there is no red wave, and like Ann said, Republicans, are disappointed. Now with that said, could I see how maybe a poll in the last few days of an election, if comes in a certain way or comes in, yeah, I could see that. I sometimes get polls that come back, and I personally say I think this is just too Republican, or I think this is too Democratic, and I'll tell my clients that. But certainly. There is certainly a motivation in this political media ecosystem and this partisan media ecosystem to only, even if people aren't conducting fraudulent polls and people aren't making up interviews, to only amplify the things that confirm a pre-existing bias.
Right, right. That definitely does. That definitely happens. Thank you for the question. Kent, come on in, tell folks who don't know who you support, where you are, and ask your polling question.
Thank you, Mark, for calling on me. I am in Atlanta. I support Trump in this election. My question is, given the Trump overperformance to polls, particularly in the blue wall in 2016 and 20, how are the pollsters adjusting for that? Have they really tried to model exactly what the electorate actually said in 2020 and 2016 in the 2024 election?
Yeah, probably the biggest question I get maybe most of all, and for some, the biggest question out there. Who wants to have a shot at that vital question?
Well, I mean,
first of all, I don't think that we know whether or not a polling error like that's going to happen again. Polling error is kind of random, although in the newsletter, Mark, you alluded to, I did uncover a chart from Pew that looks at polling error over time, over every election cycle since the start of polling. And it does turn out that I've said it's random, but it does turn out that it does, at least in the post-war period, that Democrats do tend to be overestimated a little bit more by polls, but it's not by a great amount. Look, I think that polls are only one source of information. You need to be looking at election results. You need to be looking at, how has the state trended previously? What did the polling say about these states versus in 2020 versus what it said, what the actual results were previously? And a couple weeks ago, I was seeing in the polls, showing Kamala Harris doing a lot better in the Rust Belt states than I think she should have based on, what the results actually look like in 2020. There seemed to be an idiosyncratic shift her way across the battlegrounds and in the Rust Belt states. But, it turns out a week later, that has subsided. And I think it's subsided based on the fact that, we just have more polling, but also things are changing pretty rapidly. When polls are taken in one state, looks very different than when polls are taken in another state. So I would say if you get a poll out there, right, that says Wisconsin is going to vote, 5 or 6 points to the left of Pennsylvania, I'm going to call BS on that. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. I think that those two states are going to vote pretty much in line with each other. Now, whether that's for Harris or for Trump, I don't know yet. But things like that are things like strange indicators in the data are things that I'm gonna be looking for.
yeah,
David or Ann, you want to comment on that?
I have. So one thing that you'll recognize, and we pollsters get some as an industry get to take a little bit of false credit for it, is it looks like the polling's not that bad, and we keep saying that after the election. That's because our polling get better as we get closer to the election day, to be honest. And that's why you look at the polls, and what people remember is, 16 when Clinton was up, 8 points and multiple key swing states, and swing that she lost, right? And then like, or somewhere like Pennsylvania, I can't remember what the average was. And same thing in 20. And even though, as Celinda said earlier, we do stratification and we're trying to control for the things, but there's issues that we're missing a lot. I mean, we miss a lot can get missed, and we don't have the magic answer for it. If we did, that wouldn't have happened in 20 again, and it wouldn't happen in 16. So. But I do think that as you get closer to the election, why do people take polls anyways? Well, like, people are most civically engaged across the board when it gets really close to election. So some of those voters that even Patrick was talking about earlier, who are, in the rural areas that maybe we're missing right now in those segments that we think we have them in, now they're starting to answer polls a little bit higher rate. So, all the pollsters, we get a lot better as we get closer to election because, people do because the incentive to take polls kind of equal across all of these people are very civically engaged because the election is around the corner. Like, most voters aren't on calls like this. As I think Ann said, they're getting information now. Like, there are low information voters, but like, people are getting exposed to 10 times more than they were even 5 years ago. So we'll see if it's happening again this year. We'll see if for some reason, once again, it's over predicting the Democratic candidate because we're in August and September. That seems to be what happens. But I think it ends up leveling out as we get closer to the election.
Yeah, and the Trump campaign's counting on that. All right, 5 o'clock, so we're going to stop. Thanks to Ann and David and Patrick and Celinda. All of you asked questions. You'll get if you're a subscriber to my Substack, you'll get an email from me shortly with David's full poll, the slides he showed, plus some additional data from the survey, a link to Patrick's Substack, which you should subscribe to, and a link to the YouTube video of this effort today. You can share all of that with anybody you want. Again, if you're a journalist, please give credit to David Burrell and Wick Insights, as well as to Two-Way. And we'll be back if there's breaking news over the weekend. Otherwise, 9 a.m. Monday, even though it's a holiday, for the morning meeting with Sean, Tim, and me. And again, grateful to Ann, Patrick, David, and Celinda. Have a good evening, good holiday weekend, and we'll see you no later than Monday morning, 9 a.m. Eastern time. Thank you.